evening, everybody. We're so glad to have you all here and to have such a good, healthy, happy, full house. Welcome to the McFaddin-Ward House. I'm Belle Maureen. I'm the programming director here, and we are just delighted to have you here tonight to enjoy our renowned speaker, Anita McBride. But you know how I do this. Before we start, I have to give you a little hint of what's coming up at the McFaddin-Ward House. Our next lecture is Thursday, February 20th, and it's going to feature Danny Michael from the Cody Firearms Museum in Cody, Wyoming. And he's going to share history of the firearms in America, and he'll also conduct a firearms clinic here for identification purposes, conservation, and history of the firearm that you bring in. Then on Sunday, March 2nd, that ushers in our SOAR event, our month-long SOAR event, which features the butterfly. And we will begin with SOAR Family Day, which is filled with music and food and activities. It's a really fun time. And then we'll follow up with SOAR Saturdays during the month, and that will be, we'll have live music playing in the museum, which is really nice. It's live piano music, and the pianist is truly fabulous. And then we're also going to have SOAR ceramic classes during the month, and to kind of look at that fun historic pastime of porcelain painting that the McFaddins enjoyed. Then our SOAR finale will be music with McFaddin's event featuring string benders out of Houston, and it'll be on our East Lawn, which is always fun. Then April brings Bob Whitman back to the museum. Many of you really enjoyed him, and we're bringing him back. And he's going to lecture on art fraud. So I hope you will please join us. And as always, these events are admission-free and generously underwritten by the Mamie McFaddin-Ward Heritage Foundation. At this time, I would like to acknowledge and thank our dedicated museum board members in the audience. We have Leslie Wilson. And Leslie, happy birthday. We have Lane Wilson and Mitch Smith, wave Mitch in the back, and Martha Hicks, wave Martha, and Ida, I'm not sure, I don't think Ida is here tonight, Ida Powell. Our wonderful director, Tony Chavot, has been called to Washington to assist with the presidential transition. So we will miss him here at the museum, but I am thrilled to have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight. Tonight, we have the very distinct honor of welcoming Anita McBride into our community to share her wealth of knowledge and unparalleled expertise on the First Ladies and the inner workings of the White House. She will share fascinating insights into her acclaimed book, Remember the First Ladies, The Legacies of America's History-Making Women, which I believe is still available for purchase in our lobby, and you can also get it on Amazon. Anita McBride currently serves as the director of the First Ladies Initiative at the American University. Her remarkable career spans 2 decades in the White House and includes service in 3 presidential administrations, where she held key roles such as assistant to President George Bush, chief of staff to First Lady Laura Bush, director of the White House personnel under Presidents Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, and special assistants for White House management under George H.W. Bush. Most recently, we could have seen Anita, we did see her, on CNN for commentary on President Jimmy Carter's state funeral. And Monday, you will see Anita on many networks in commentary on the inauguration. In reading about Anita, I loved her reflections on sitting in the carpool lane and receiving a call from First Lady Laura Bush's office in the White House with a request to interview for the position of the First Lady's Chief of Staff. I could personally relate to the carpool line part of this, but that's the only part of that I could relate to. Anita McBride's accomplishments are vast, and her insights on soft power are gripping. So I will take no further time, as we all want to spend every minute we have here with the lady herself. Please join me in a warm welcome for Anita McBride.
Wow. this is such a great, warm, welcoming crowd. I love being in Beaumont. I've been here 24 hours. I've met so many people. I want to thank the Wilsons for being so kind to pick me up and so gracious, and Belle, all the courtesies that you gave me today, and to see the McFaddin-Ward House through with the curators. I've loved it. This is wonderful. I've been looking forward to coming here, being with you, and I also want to thank Sarah Parker, who was with me every step of the way for some interviews that we did today with local media, which was really fun. We have a lot of history to cover, but we're going to do the most that we can of 248 years in about 40 minutes. I've got some slides, so some visuals for you to look at and be distracted so you don't have to stare at me the whole time. But I did, want to start by saying I love this topic of First Ladies. I love telling their stories. So many of these stories are not told. They're also underrepresented. Many First Ladies are misrepresented. So our attempt is really to cover the sweep of history from Martha to Jill, and now to Mrs. Trump again, and peel back some of the layers of the contributions that they have made to our country. And so the first thing I can say is Americans have been curious about First Ladies since Martha Washington journeyed from Mount Vernon to our nation's new capital in New York City in May of 1789 after her husband had been inaugurated. She was not there when he was elected president. She was not there for his inauguration. She had to close up the house at Mount Vernon. But she made this trip, and she broke with convention for a woman of her time, and actually on her journey stopped in Philadelphia and made impromptu remarks, which was unusual for this era. Modern First Ladies are, of course, much more visible in the media, very, very active on social media. There's many more biographies about them. There's a lot of programming that we see about them. But the deep study of them and their influence on American society and the presidency in particular is very limited. So the books, you heard Belle mention one that's here tonight, Remember the First Ladies, The Legacies of America's History-Making Women. That was the second book. The book that preceded that was actually a textbook. If you can imagine, the first ever textbook at any level that we published, my co-authors and I, in August of 2023 to help fill this gap of knowledge of First Ladies. We feel it's not possible to look at the arc of American history without examining them and telling their story and considering their influence and all of their achievements. One interesting thing about the textbook, and there's a professor here today, so I'd love for him to hear this, and also a student, is from all the students that we previewed the textbook with before it was issued, all said the same thing. They marveled at the little-known legacies of these women. They asked, why did we never learn this before? So we knew we were filling that gap. The book that's featured here tonight, the title for that one, we drew inspiration from a First Lady herself, from Abigail Adams, who counseled her husband John to remember the ladies when drafting the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. Be kinder to women than your ancestors have been, she said. If not, we would foment a rebellion. So as we know, of course, women were not written into the Constitution, and it would be 133 years before there was a constitutional amendment giving them any political rights. In just a few days, we will be witnessing another inauguration in our country. The constitutional oath for president is very short. It's only 35 words. But the Constitution does not have one word about the First Lady and what she is supposed to do. And to this day, there is still no formalized position description, and there was no formal budget for a First Lady staff until 1978, when Rosalind Carter pushed for it. In her memoirs, Rosalind describes this was the only fight she and her husband Jimmy ever had, because he campaigned on cutting the White House staff in the controversial post-Watergate era. And she, of course, sought to expand it. I will say she won, because the office and the structure that was established under the tenure of the Carter administration is still the structure that supports the First Lady's office today. But make no mistake, despite that fight over the staff, the Carters had a true political partnership. She was deeply involved in every aspect of his presidency. And we learned a lot about Rosalind and all of her work at her funeral last year, more than people had realized of what she had accomplished. And the same with President Carter last week. There was a greater analysis about his presidential years. And because we knew a lot more, of course, about the post-presidency years, the longest post-presidency any president has ever had. But there is no one way to be a first lady. The influential role is really rewritten by each person and shaped by their individual character, their personality, and their interests. And their history, the history of First Ladies, parallels that of women in the country who did slowly gain rights, who found their voices in the public square and became independent players on the political stage. Our books show how First Ladies are not only mirrors of their times, but leaders as well. We analyze them from a few different perspectives: how they influence development of the role, how their marital relationship and their husband's view of the role impacted them, and how they impacted their husbands' administrations, and ultimately where they left legacies of their own. So we're going to go on to another slide so you have something else to look at. There we go. So to understand the evolution, we have to look at the first three First Ladies: Martha, Abigail, and Dolly. These are the women who taught us how to operate in a new republic. They were devoted to our struggle for independence. They knew there was no guarantee the new nation would survive, but they were committed to their husbands and the nation's success, and they did whatever was necessary to ensure both. They were intelligent, imaginative, savvy, and very aware of their place in history. And they knew they were positioned to have influence. In fact, George Washington recognized immediately that his was a two-person job, serving as both head of state and head of government. And he made sure Martha was greeted with great fanfare when she arrived in New York, demonstrating to everyone that her role as presidential partner to assist him with the head of state duties was important. Being a partner to George was not new to Martha, as she had joined him in the winter camps throughout the Revolutionary War and did what she could to help maintain troop morale and keep soldiers fed and clothed. In fact, Martha donated $20,000 from her personal funds, that's equivalent to about $450,000 today, to purchase clothing for soldiers as part of a woman-led charitable effort. It's remarkable that she maintained a level of control over her own considerable wealth that she had inherited from her first husband. That was not a common practice for a woman of her time. When Martha arrived in New York, she was surprised that George's advisors immediately handed her a list of social events to host. And she was irked by their determination to try and dictate some of her actions. In a letter to her niece Fanny Bassett, she describes her first months as the president's wife as being like a state prisoner. But together, George and Martha set precedent for their roles. To support causes, to raise money for different causes. When she was asked by Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore to raise money for the school, she agreed to do it on one condition: that they would admit women for the first time on an equal basis, and they did. Yeah, that was a step you have to consider. That's the late 1800s. So now we're moving fast in our history. We're bridging 2 centuries from the 19th to the 20th, and the first lady of the rapidly changing 20th century is Edith Roosevelt. And she's notable for several reasons, including succeeding in enlarging the White House to make the family quarters completely private,
and oversee the design for a new executive wing, which we call now the West Wing, for the president's staff to be moved out of her home. And why did she need to do that? She came into the White House with a big family, 5 children, and then also a stepdaughter from Teddy Roosevelt's first marriage. She needed to have the president's staff out of their space. But when she redesigned the White House in the second floor of family quarters, she put an office right next to Teddy's with a door in between so that it was always open and she could always hear what was going on. She too would cut things from the papers. She was definitely a confidant and an advisor to her husband. She also did something for the office of First Lady. She professionalized the role by hiring the first professional staff member, which was a social secretary, to help her manage all of the social obligations and also help to manage feeding the press with some photos of her family, taking the pressure off her by the press, who was very intrusive and wanted to know more about this young family. What was most striking about Edith, however, was a significant behind-the-scenes role she played as a conduit for information between her husband and a British diplomat stationed in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1905. This is when Teddy, her husband, was asked to help mediate the end to the Russo-Japanese War. Both countries were fighting, Russia and Japan were fighting for greater influence in Asia. The president needed intelligence on what the Russians were doing. Not much has changed in our world, sadly. In one of the most direct acts of diplomacy by a first lady ever, Edith was the solution to communicate with the British diplomat who could not do that directly with Teddy. A British historian familiar with the correspondence declared Edith the perfection of invisible government. Roosevelt's eventual successful negotiation to end that war earned him the Nobel Peace Prize, the first ever awarded to an American president. There is no doubt Edith played a role. Edith was also often a back channel of information to bypass the government bureaucracy. Talk about something that never changes. She was politically astute and her husband trusted her. In fact, Teddy once remarked, "Whenever I go against her judgment, I regret it." Edith's successor, Nellie Taft, was a strong first lady who publicly supported women's equality in education and careers and actively promoted legislation for better working conditions for women. One interesting fact about Nellie that we found in our research, during the election of 1912, and her husband is running for nomination of his party, running for re-election, Nellie attended the Republican convention. He was a Republican, of course. But she also attended the Democratic convention and sat in the front row thinking that her husband's opponents would be a little less vile against him. That took guts. I don't think any first lady has ever done that. Ellen Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's first wife, suffered from poor health while she was in the White House, but she took up the cause of cleaning up Washington, D.C. slums. This is one of the first ladies who really took up a serious cause. And this is something she continued to her deathbed, when Congress rushed through the Alley Bill so that she could know about it while she was still alive. Ellen also visited public offices to review workplace conditions for federal employees, especially women. When the Postmaster General did not respond to her concerns about the unsanitary conditions, word somehow got to the New York Times. They reported on her inspections, causing those changes to be made. Her visible activities to address societal issues were emblematic of the era's reform movements that brought more women out of the private sphere of the home and into the public square. Now, Woodrow's second wife, Edith Wilson, is another story. Hers is an example of extraordinary overreach of power by a first lady, controlling access to President Wilson after he had a debilitating stroke. For 17 months, neither the president's cabinet nor the Congress saw Woodrow Wilson. The vice president saw him only once in that time. In her memoirs, she disputes that she controlled access to the president, but it is irrefutable. Second part of our Bridging Two Centuries, we're going to move on to some later First Ladies. In 1920, women's suffrage became a reality, and Florence Harding was the first First Lady to cast vote for president, and it was for her husband. It was a more auspicious time for female activism, and her visibility in Warren Harding's campaign brought more women to the ballot box. She also owned a newspaper. She knew the power of media. She orchestrated Harding's political rise from his first run for the Ohio legislature to the presidency. In fact, in our book, we start each chapter with a quote, mostly from First Ladies, but we have a few from presidents. And one of my favorites is one from Florence Harding that says, "Of course I know what's good for the president. I put him in the White House." Florence took on the cause of prison reform, especially women's prisons. And as a divorced woman, she broke with protocol and invited divorced women to social events. She also supported women journalists and invited them to her White House events. Grace Coolidge, who assumed her public role of Second Lady and First Lady after spending years as an educator of deaf children. She was dedicated to charitable causes as First Lady. She took a special interest to make the White House more accessible to people with disabilities. The problem was Calvin did not believe there was a role, or should be a role, for women in politics, which limited her to becoming a traditional First Lady role after some of her 20th century predecessors had begun to make advances. But Lou Hoover, who was the first woman to graduate from Stanford with a geology degree and emphasized equal opportunities for women, helped to change the image of First Lady again. As honorary president of the Girl Scouts, she encouraged greater emphasis on young women to gain skills to be leaders in society and to do relief work and to focus on civic education. Lou Hoover was an independent woman who also broke ground as the first First Lady to deliver a radio broadcast, using those addresses to mobilize young people to become active civic participants. Lou definitely paved the way for the most activist First Lady in our history, Eleanor Roosevelt. The longest serving First Lady, 12 years. Eleanor is one of 3 First Ladies who gets her own chapter in our books. Lady Bird Johnson has her own chapter, another Texas First Lady, our nation's first environmental activist First Lady, champion for civil rights, and Michelle Obama, the nation's first African American First Lady. Eleanor did not want to be consigned to ceremonial duties, and she felt the role would stifle her and the life that she had had as a politically active, well-paid public speaker. She offered to be Franklin's personal assistant, to do his correspondence, to travel for him, but Franklin did not want her to have an active role. Eleanor found her own ways to be independent. In fact, she refused Secret Service agents and drove her own car, keeping a gun in the glove compartment for security that she was trained to learn how to use. She held the first First Lady press conference, only inviting women reporters because they were locked out of the president's press conferences. In over her 12 years, she held 348 weekly press conferences. She also invited Americans to write to her and to the president, and received 300,000 pieces of mail in the first year. The modern presidential correspondence office is really due to Mrs. Roosevelt and what she established. In fact, my first job in the White House in the early 80s, working for President Reagan, was in the correspondence office as a presidential analyst, reading the mail, which back then came in big bags from the U.S. Postal Service, and you had to open and slice open the envelope and read and code the mail. The woman who trained me how to read the mail was hired in the last years of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. She was still reading the mail and training young people like me every change of administration. not focus on one project. She took on projects as they came up, and many of them dealt with her husband's New Deal programs. Franklin and his advisors eventually saw her value. She ultimately traveled so much for him for his New Deal programs and also overseas that she was recognized as the president's eyes, ears, and legs. She was a forceful advocate against racial discrimination and a strong proponent of civil and human rights globally. But it was not without controversy, and she was not without her critics. But she did create a bond with the American people through her daily newspaper column called My Day, her weekly Sunday radio broadcast that she did from the lower level of the White House. In fact, it was Eleanor's voice on December 7th, 1941, that Americans heard first after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The president had issued a written statement, but he did not speak to the Congress till the next day in his famous Day of Infamy speech. But Eleanor that evening, that Sunday, while the nation was in shock, she spoke as a mother with 2 sons in the military stationed in the Pacific. She knew the fears mothers would now feel to be sending their sons to war, and appealed to them and to all Americans to have strength and courage. Now, can you imagine following Eleanor? Poor Bess Truman. The last thing she wanted to do was be First Lady. She did not like the limelight, nor the intrusive press poking around with questions about her personal life. She was fearful the public would learn that her father had died by suicide, a stigma her mother never recovered from. In fact, Bess burst into tears when she received a call from Harry that FDR had died, and that she and their daughter Margaret needed to hurry down to the White House for his swearing in. We have that picture of her in our book where you can see she is visibly shaken while he's taking the oath of office in the White House. Bess had been encouraged by Eleanor to continue the weekly women's press conferences, and Bess held one. She answered only one question the year she was married, and she never held another press conference. Bess had spent a lot of time in Missouri, but there was no doubt she was Harry's most important confidant and the most valuable political partner in his public life. There was not one decision he made without her. When criticized by a reporter for relying on his wife too much, he responded emphatically, "Why wouldn't I rely on her? She has better judgment than anyone else." One last story about Bess that's important to know. In 1948, the White House was deemed uninhabitable, and the Trumans had to move out across the street to Blair House, the president's guest house, for a 3.5-year reconstruction and remodeling of the White House. There were 3 proposals presented to the Trumans, which had to be funded by Congress, of course. Of course, the Congress wanted to go the cheapest route, and that would be to tear the entire White House down and start over. It was Bess Truman who used her knowledge of how the Senate appropriation process works and her relationships with senators and their spouses from her days of having been a Senate staffer in her husband's office. She sent the message behind the scenes to them that if you do that, tear the White House down, the American people will never forgive you. Both Bess and Mamie were 2 first ladies, Mamie Eisenhower, 2 first ladies who stepped back from social activism. But both women had considerable influence on the White House. Mamie, as a general's wife, saw her job as making her husband's life comfortable. She was well versed in entertaining and protocol. The Eisenhowers, in fact, hosted 37 heads of state, more than any first couple before them. I have to digress for a moment, though, and tell you a little story about Mamie that I was reminded of that was in the book when I went through the tour of the McFaddin-Ward House today. And I was really struck by the pink color that was in several of the rooms. And the first thing I thought of was Mamie Eisenhower. And this is why. Okay, in the 8 years that the Eisenhowers lived in the White House, Mamie only went to the Oval Office 4 times. That was the president's domain. Hers was the house. And she said, as a general's wife, a wife never went near the headquarters. You never went to his place of operation. But the family residence was her refuge. It's where she and Ike could relax. She allowed no one from the West Wing into their residence without her permission. She required the family quarters to be free of work-related stress. She also decorated in a way that provided comfort and serenity for them. The Eisenhower's bedroom took on the Mamie look, with fabrics in shades of pink and a certain shade of green on the walls. In this color choice, there is also evidence that she influenced the 1950s consumer culture and the period's tastes by painting her bedroom pink. First Lady Pink, or Mamie Pink, became well known and used by clothing designers and manufacturers for products found in homes all across America. I know my own parents' home built in the early 60s was pink everywhere, and pink appliances and pink bathrooms. But obviously it started here first, because this was before maybe Eisenhower. Going on to Jackie Kennedy, we of course think of Mrs. Kennedy as the First Lady who did more to preserve the White House, and she rightfully deserves enormous credit for her restoration efforts. She did not share her husband's taste for politics, and her tenure as First Lady dialed back on activism, but it mirrored her tastes and interests. President Kennedy did not want Jackie to choose preservation as her cause. He and his advisors feared it would be seen as elitist, but she ignored them and ultimately created an enduring bond with the American people to their White House. If you remember, in February 14 of 1962, Mrs. Kennedy did a walk and talk through the White House in black and white television with CBS reporter Charles Collingwood. For most Americans, if not all Americans, it was the first time they had seen the White House, and she really did create a bond with them. The way she spoke about every part of the collection, every room, was something that really helped to educate them about their house, and she called it the People's House. She had the White House declared a museum, and she established the first White House curator position to care for all of its treasures. She established the White House Historical Association. I'm very privileged to be on their board, but as a nonprofit organization to privately fund all the restorations, all the acquisitions of historic furniture, decorative arts, and paintings for the White House collection. She knew there would never be enough money for that. She also remembered her first visit to the White House when she was 11 years old, and walking with her mother from room to room and being so disappointed that there was no guidebook to tell you anything about what you were seeing. 20 years later, as the new First Lady, she created the first White House Visitor's Guide, selling it for $1 as people walked through on the White House tours. That book is now in its 34th printing and continues to be a signature feature of the association's education mission and funding. We charge more than $1 now. Lady Bird Johnson followed Jackie after one of the most traumatic times in our country, and she sought to restore the model of Eleanor's activism. In 1964, she embarked on a whistle-stop tour through 9 southern states to campaign for her husband's election and to push support for his unpopular Civil Rights Act. It's important to underscore her courage here, because this trip was deemed too dangerous for President Johnson to do because of bomb threats. So a train preceded Lady Bird by 15 minutes at each stop. And this trip is credited with helping Lyndon win 3 southern states at a time it was feared that Southern Democrats would bolt the party. The women who followed in this era is Pat Nixon. I love to tell stories about Pat Nixon, one of our most misunderstood and underrepresented First Ladies. She is the most traveled First Lady in history, 81 countries, more than any other. She also had an enduring connection or brought enduring connection of people also to the White House, made it more accessible in ways it hadn't been made before. She installed ramps for the disabled. She had the White House lit at night so that people could see the White House when they were in the city of Washington. She also did tours at night for women because women were going into the workforce in bigger numbers. Tours for the blind, pamphlets in different languages, foreign languages, so that foreign visitors, when they came to visit the White House, could read about what they were saying. Betty Ford, Rosalind Carter, Nancy Reagan, Barbara Bush, they all helped to move the model forward in their own ways. Betty and these World War II wives came from different backgrounds, but they shared living through the Great Depression and coming of age during a major world war. They saw a rise in communism and a new global political arena. They were an integral part of their husbands' Cold War agendas. Betty and Rosalind in particular saw the rise of the second wave of feminism in our country, a movement to provide opportunities beyond suffrage. Three of the First Ladies, Pat, Betty, and Rosalind, took a stand on the ERA, often to criticism, and often to the chagrin of their husbands' advisors who felt that this would hurt the president with voters. Pat's significant contributions to the White House, as I mentioned, were overshadowed by her husband's Watergate scandal. Betty, in this picture you see here in the upper left, showed tremendous courage going public with her breast cancer, changing women's health forever. This was a period of time where the word cancer or the word breast was not mentioned in public. And the medical community would say that women's health is measured in two timelines, before Betty Ford and after Betty Ford. By the 1980s and the 1990s, Nancy Reagan, for Nancy Reagan. Okay, wait a minute. Let's go back. Okay. By the 1980s and the 1990s, Nancy Reagan and Barbara Bush navigated new challenges of what a First Lady should represent at a time when society was trying to come to grips with growing cultural and political change. Mrs. Reagan, in her first year, had a very difficult relationship with the press. She also suffered the trauma of the attempted assassination on her husband's life. This was a time, of course, of recession in the country. Mrs. Reagan, coming into the White House, had been counseled that the White House needed new china. And so she, with the payment by a private source, the White House Historical Association, purchased new china for the White House. It was seen as politically tone deaf at a time of recession. So her first year was tough. This picture here we like to show because this was a dinner, a Washington institution dinner, which is called the Gridiron Dinner. It's been going on since the 1890s. It's every March in Washington, D.C. This is March of 1982, 1 year after Mrs. Reagan had been in the White House. She dressed up really as a bag lady in all of these mismatched clothes and came out, her husband didn't know this was happening either, came out singing a skit to the tune of Secondhand Rose, but called Secondhand Clothes. And at the very end of the skit, she took a china plate and smashed it on the ground. Well, it surprised everyone, the sense of humor that she displayed and self-deprecating humor that she displayed began to change a little bit the view of the press of Mrs. Reagan. But it was not easy for her, for sure. Barbara Bush devoted her life, another Texas First Lady. You're so lucky. You have 3 presidential libraries and 3 presidents and first ladies here from your state. Barbara Bush devoted her public life to tackling illiteracy. She established a literacy foundation within months of becoming First Lady that operates to this day. She left office a beloved First Lady with a stratospheric approval rate. No one has come close to it. Her daughter-in-law, Laura Bush, was First Lady during one of the most tumultuous and consequential periods in American history. She went from reticent political spouse to active and popular First Lady who balanced the traditional and modern expectations of the role. She traveled to all 50 states and 77 countries, serving with dignity and grace at home and abroad. Martha Washington could never have imagined that one of her successors could run for elective office as Hillary Clinton did. Although the public co-presidency the Clintons tried to achieve in the White House was not feasible nor desirable, her political influence nevertheless was powerful. Hillary's election as a U.S. Senator and appointment as a cabinet member were firsts for a First Lady, as is being the first to run for president and to win a major party nomination for president. As I mentioned earlier, Michelle Obama was a historic First Lady in her own right, and she was the first Lady of the digital age, and the documentation and visuals of her work is extensive. Melania Trump, who made history as the second foreign-born First Lady after Louisa Catherine Adams, was criticized for not moving to the White House right away in 2017. And she operated in a very defensive environment and tried to use social media and released her own short videos to show what she was doing to try and get her message out her way. Jill Biden broke ground as being the first Lady to hold a job outside the White House, proving the point that the position is really rewritten by each occupant and shaped by their individual interests, their character, and their personality. So that certainly is the case again for Melania Trump, who makes history again as a second First Lady to return to the White House in non-consecutive terms, sharing this distinction with Frances Cleveland. In Mrs. Trump's own words, she will be defined by her choices and not others' expectations of her or this role. Her recent interviews indicate she is returning to the White House with a greater sense of confidence. That undoubtedly comes from knowing what it's already like to move into the White House. Familiarity with its rooms, the staff who was there to take care of you, the majority of them are still there. I think people are eager to see her plans for how she wants to use this unique platform again. So I hope that we've gone through a huge expanse of history here, trying to give tidbits. I welcome your questions. I hope you have enjoyed learning about these remarkable women and their contributions, and of course, all that is still to come. Thank you. Anybody have questions? I hope you do. We didn't touch. There's so many people we didn't touch on. Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay, thank you. The question was about me, which is why I wrote a book about other people, because I don't like to talk about me. But thank you very much. I did have a front row seat to history. I'm very, very lucky. 3 times working in the White House. I started in the most basic of ways. I was a campaign volunteer for Ronald Reagan in 1980 as a senior in college at the University of Connecticut. He won, and I wanted to move to Washington. Of course, I had no network. I knew, no one. I was a volunteer. But little by little, I kept at it. I got a job in a re-election campaign of 1984, and that was in Washington at the national headquarters. And that's where I had a chance to meet more people. I got hired to the White House the week after the election, reading mail in the basement. But I was so happy. I had a White House pass. I was working in the White House. I didn't care that I was reading mail. I loved it. And then over, those 12 years of the Reagan-Bush years gave an opportunity to young people like me to have other chances, other experiences. So I moved into different positions in personnel, in management, and administration. I stayed with the White House through the George H.W. Bush administration, helped on his transition back to Texas. And in the 8 intervening years of the Clinton years, I was not in politics. I was working the private sector, I was newly married. We were in a different phase of our life. I wasn't expecting going back in 2000. By then I was married with 2 little children, a 3-month-old and a 3-year-old, and I got a call from Governor Bush's office in Texas. This is that period of dispute of we didn't know for 6 weeks who the president was going to be. They weren't really able to to put together a formal transition. But I knew some people on his staff who had called and had said, look, you ran the personnel office for the White House before. We're trying to put together a shadow operation. Can you help us at least get ready? And I said, well, you know what, look, I have 2 little kids. I only have help 2.5 days a week. I'll come work for you those 2.5 days. Well, that turned into 8 years of working in the White House, at the State Department, back to the White House when Mrs. Bush called me for the second term. As you heard Belle mention, I was in carpool line driving, picking up my kids from school, and Mrs. Bush wanted to talk to me. We had a great conversation up in the residence, and she laid down sort of the markers of what she wanted to do in her second term. The first thing she said was that she wanted to go to Afghanistan, and right then I knew this was going to be a very different milieu than what I thought. You know, you think of the East Wing, you plan social events, you host, you know, people, you do travel around the country, but she had a different view of how she wanted to use the second 4 years. The years go by fast. The days are long, but the years are fast, and she didn't want to waste it. She wanted to do more social entertaining. You know, after 9/11, it was very, very difficult for the Bushes to host the kind of state dinners and the number of them that they thought that they would do, because so many foreign leaders were coming to see the president, pledging support for the war on terror. It was hard to do a state visit for every single one. So she felt in the second term they needed to dial that up. And then she also wanted to work on a few domestic issues and global issues of the president's. We did a lot of travel to Africa, to the Middle East on his programs. And she was a good advocate for, in some ways, easier for the president to do it. So that's how I got it, you know, little by little, just had different experiences. I think, you know, you work hard, people want to have you on their team, and I was very, very blessed. But she did give me a front row seat to history, I'll never forget it. And that's where I really saw the multifaceted nature of this role. I mean, really, I could go in from planning a state visit for Queen Elizabeth in the morning to planning a secret trip to a war zone in the afternoon. I mean, and the hours were brutal, punishing, but I don't regret any of it. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Did you early on do commercials?
No, I do. She asked if I have done some commercials on television. No, but that's a pretty lucrative business. I wouldn't mind doing that. But no, I do do a lot of media, different outlets, and
I thought early on, real early.
no, but thank you. Maybe I have a twin maybe out there that's doing that. Yes, Professor.
A silly question.
Mm-hmm.
All of your research, who do you have a soft spot for?
You know, I have a soft spot for Pat Nixon. I felt that she was so undermined by her husband's staff. They did everything they could to really make her life difficult and to not let her have the role that she really could have helped him more. And the other person I really had a soft spot for was Bess Truman, because of some of the examples that I guess she so quietly worked behind the scenes. She was very skilled in the ways of Washington. She was a very supportive spouse. She wasn't overt. She worked behind the scenes with him. She saved the White House, and that was a story I didn't know. I also was, I was fascinated by some of the other things that Jackie Kennedy did. For example, and I once asked her daughter, Caroline, what would your mother want to be remembered for? And she said, my mother is known as this iconic, figure of fashion and style, but she would want to be known for her expansive knowledge of history. And she really did care that Americans understood their history and understood the White House and understood the connection that they should have to that, and knowing the people who lived and worked there. So, these were, again, we see sometimes the things we see in the media on the surface, and you go back and you really look at their backgrounds and experiences, and it's fascinating. And they're in this very undefined role. There is no position description for this role. There's no salary, which I am a big proponent that the position should never be paid. I think the minute you're on the federal payroll, it changes the dynamic completely. So you get to pick and choose what you want to do. And if you want to sit upstairs and eat chocolate, you can do that too. I think the Americans expect something, to do something with the role, but you don't have